Candidates right at first is, why don't you give us the 2-minute version of your biggest priorities if you're elected?
Okay. Well, actually, I think the big priority is to take this office and I think make it much more than it's been before. I think that you look around the state, communities from the state of Ohio itself to local are all facing a couple of real challenges. Dead on, obviously, how to make ends meet in a very tough time. You guys know from who you cover, revenues are dropping in most places. A lot of communities are in fiscal crisis, and there's a lot of work to do for them to simply deal with that. The second big challenge is how are all our communities going to be more competitive for jobs, for businesses, for growth, for families, for young people. Not only do we have to balance our budgets, but we have to do it in a way that we're making the decisions that actually make us more competitive. And third, you're obviously seeing fraud all over the state. Large places, small places, you're seeing, and you will see it in tougher times like this. You'll see it more, and it's happening. I think the auditor, right now, if you ask most people in the state, no one has any idea who the auditor is. They don't know what the auditor does. Insiders do, but the average person doesn't. I think the auditor needs to be a lot more relevant to these big picture issues, and I think the auditor is perfectly positioned to be a leader that helps communities through performance audits in particular understand how to be more efficient, how to reform themselves, how to reduce spending, how to balance their budgets in tough times, how to do the kind of reforms that most people know we have to do but just don't happen, sharing services, consolidation, you name it. Secondly, if you do that stuff well, you're not only saving money, you're more competitive. Third, I think the auditor needs to play a much more proactive role on fraud. It's not good enough to just have a press conference five years down the road after the fraud's been happening and say, hey, we found out that $3 million are gone. That's a defeat. Auditors around the country, and I want to do it here, are much more proactive about getting with community officials before the fraud happens and explaining what are the best practices, what are the red flags, what are the things that you can put in place to keep the fraud from happening in the first place, or if it does happen, detect it very, very early. This plan I've laid out walks through all these and other issues. I think the auditor can also really be on the front end of assuring transparency, assuring good ethics, you name it. I bring all this to you not as someone who's just studied, but as someone who's done this. I've been on Cincinnati City Council. I got there after the riots. I worked very hard to clean up our city. We revitalized our downtown, made important investments, and kept spending in check. After 4 years, spending was up, I think, under 2% over 4 years. County Commission, I got to handle County Commission. I reduced spending to the lowest level more than a decade. In between city and county, I've reduced property tax rates 5 times in my seven budgets. And I've pushed, I'm not just talking about these reforms, I've pushed for these types of reforms. I've reformed government, I've merged services, I've consolidated services, I've created regional approaches rather than every jurisdiction doing their own thing. So when I get to the auditor's office, I'm not just winging it or doing it for the first time. This is what I've done since I got to office in '01. And I think that's the kind of experience that lends itself to the kind of role I think the auditor can play. We need to do this work in Ohio. We need to be reforming government. We need to have all governments think through how they can do better, do more with less. I think the auditor can play a real role there, and I think I bring the experience. And so far, every newspaper that's endorsed has agreed with me that my plan makes sense, and that I have that track record that allows me to take on these issues the minute I get there.
Can you, just in layman's terms for the average person on the street, explain what a performance audit is? Performance
audit is essentially people think of audits, the financial audit typically, which is, obviously attesting to the financial statements that they sort of add up, make sense, follow the basic accounting standards, etc. That's a very important process. It assures transparency, it assures good government, it assures citizens their money is being spent as it should. But performance audits, I think, get to the heart of what a lot of citizens are frustrated about. Not just is government sort of following, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but are they actually spending our money well? Or are they wasting money? Or are they holding back on reforms that would save the money? Is there low-hanging fruit and redundancies?
How do you measure those efficiencies to find out if they are performing well? What's the benchmark?
Well, you benchmark in 2 ways, and I've laid out a whole benchmarking approach here. You benchmark both with public and private sector. But I do think you work very hard to make sure you are comparing how you do to other governments and the private sector. And I think any good performance audit, you're bringing in benchmarks, you're bringing in best practices. One of the things I think the auditor can do beyond just individual performance audits, is be sort of an inventory of best practices, of what works. You know, I know what works in my neck of the woods. I know what's worked in northern Ohio in some areas. I know around the country, every government has tried some things that work somewhere. And too often, communities are so caught up, you know, understandably, in the day-to-day, how do we get through this nightmare, that they don't have the time or the ability to go understand what works. So I think you should always be benchmarking and always be looking at best practices. And some of the things I've done in Hamilton County, Cincinnati, were taking private best practices. We've done reverse auctions, which has saved us a lot of money in purchasing. That's something the private sector did years ago that government has been slow to do. So I think you basically should always be looking to, you know, both private and public benchmarks. But back to the performance audit, I mean, I think it's very important, and I've laid out, we both talk about performance audits. I don't think there's any real debate about do we need more of them. Yes, we do. I've laid out, having talked to folks, and I've benchmarked my own ideas. I've talked to experts in other parts of the country. Washington State is the model of trying to really ramp up performance audits. And they laid out ways to make it less political so people actually want to do them. And they also said, you can't...
They've done so well they have no income tax.
Who's that?
Washington State.
I'm talking about their state auditor.
I know, I mean, they benchmarked so well they don't even have to have an income tax.
I haven't gotten into their tax, I'm talking about their
Right.
approach to auditing. But they have gone out and and studied how they could do more performance audits. And I've used that as a model where you select the topics not based on, not out of the blue, but based on low-hanging fruit, based on a real matrix of risk and how you can save the most money. And then you go and do that audit. And then, and the other big change in what I'm proposing is that we don't simply, right now basically, unless it's a school in crisis, the deal on performance audit is you just go to governments and you say, can you pay for a performance audit that we'll do? And most people aren't doing that. So they don't do the work. And if you look at the budget of the state auditor's office, all the talk of performance audits, only 5% of the budget is for performance audits. To me, that doesn't sound like a priority. I think we should make the other parts of the auditor's office more efficient, and there are ways to do that. I think there's a lot of modernization that could happen, so that you actually can devote more of the state auditor's budget to doing the work that I think brings such great value added to government at all levels.
Are you saying that there are two different types of audits that are done? There's a performance audit and then a...
Yeah, there's your standard financial audit, and then occasionally, in certain situations, sometimes it gets as requested. Sometimes in the case of a government in fiscal emergency, they get a performance audit basically for free and automatically, and then you can do special audits. But you know, there are thousands of financial audits done and a few performance audits. What I'm saying is I think the big transition in this office, given it's one of the biggest in the entire country, it's one of the top 2 or 3 in terms of staffing, is to carve out more time and resources to actually do the performance audit work, which I think most would agree is, again, what business leaders, what citizens want to see, which is a real drill down on how government can be more efficient, more effective, and also leads to the kind of reform that people are interested in. And I think citizens know what we need to do, and that study after study have shown we should be thinking about.
What's the difference between what you're talking about with performance audits and what people like Mary Taylor and State House Republicans have been pushing for with performance audits and have gotten pushed back by Governor Strickland and the Democrats?
Not a lot. I've agreed with the legislation they put forward. I mean, I'm all for it. I want more performance audits. You know, I think you are seeing a little bit of the politics there. And, you know, people think if, well, it's political, they don't want to have a performance audit. My attitude is, from the moment I get there, I'm going to make it very clear this office is not a political shop. You guys don't know me too well, but I come from a Republican-leaning part of the county, of the state. I've always had crossover support. I've always been very independent-minded. I pushed for things that fellow Democrats didn't like. And from the very moment I get there, this office is going to be independent. So if I'm showing up to do a performance audit, I'm not there to make political hay. I'm not there to score partisan points. I'm there to help save money. And in this time, if people aren't interested in finding out how to save money, then they're missing the boat on where we are. So I think that's been mainly political. But I do think the things I proposed here will make it more likely. A couple things, as I said. One, you can't just pick an area out of the blue and expect people to, you know, if you just say, I'm going to audit this, and there's no process open, transparent, deliberative process where you actually select the topic, then people think it's some kind of political witch hunt. And that's what Washington said. We have a very clear, they said to me, a very clear, transparent process of selecting the most strategic areas to audit. And so when you pick it, people aren't already suspicious that you're just doing something political. And two, I think if you're willing to put money into it, and not just say, you know, we're showing up, you don't even know why we picked this topic, and by the way, you pay for everything, that's why people aren't doing it. And I think having some kind of shared cost where the auditor's office itself says, we care about this so much, we're actually not going to just make you pay for it, we'll put some in as well. That, I hope, will help make people more open to this. But I'll tell you as a county commissioner, we're all looking for savings. If this is put together in a way that feels not political, and that you feel like someone is seriously coming to the table to help, and they're willing to put some money into it, I think most officials would grab the opportunity to do this work.
Won't that come out, that money support come out of the general operating fund of the state, or where will that?
Yeah, well, the state auditor's office has a big budget in and of itself, and I think, you know, like every other office, it needs to prioritize. And I think there are savings. And you talk to anyone who is sort of a private firm, and again, going to benchmarking, and they will tell you that in terms of the technology, modernization, that the state auditor's office, in some cases, is years behind the times.
Is that your first performance audit then?
Good question. I wanted to listen very seriously to, and I've already talked to folks about this. And to her credit, Mary Taylor is also on. She has been beginning to work to modernize. She's moving to paperless. So there's been work that's been done, but there's a lot more to go. And I believe that there are a lot of efficiencies. And you start doing that. You start doing those things differently. You're saving on travel costs. You're saving on other things that right now, because of a dated approach, you're spending a lot of money on. So what my goal is to find efficiencies there, to use outside firms more on some of the standard audits, so we have more ability to really do robust performance audit work, which gets at the issues again that I think get to how do we save money and how do we compete. And let me just say, I mean, this is, and I put it in here, there is a big difference between myself and Dave Yost. I've actually dramatically reduced spending. I know how to do it. I've reduced spending at the lowest level more than a decade. You know, good or bad, he's at a county where he hasn't reduced spending. He's more than doubled it. His spending is up 150% in 7 years. So whatever the reason for that, he'll say, well, his population grew. Well, his spending grew at 8 times the rate of his population growth. Either way, I have experience of rolling up my sleeves, making tough decisions, and dramatically reducing spending. And that's, so when I sit, and doing the kind of reforms we're talking about, and you'll see that in this packet. So when I sit down with a city or a county that faces a fiscal crisis and has to reduce spending, I'm not a stranger as to how to do that. That's what I've done. And you'll even see the Inquirer, a pretty conservative paper, gave me the endorsement for the early vote at least, and said, this guy knows what he's talking about on fiscal matters that are relevant to this office.
So if you're able to, you know, do the general practices of